Welcome to the MAPS Canada webinar series. My name is Shannon Smedella, and I'm your host for the series. We are extremely excited to have you join us for our 14th and final episode of our webinar series. Since the beginning of June, we've had an amazing selection of speakers, luminaries, scientists, doctors, and visionaries lined up just for you. We've gathered some of the best in the field to share important information and their take on the psychedelic renaissance. We are in the middle of the psychedelic renaissance, with research projects and decriminalization proposals popping up across North America, and with MDMA on the verge of approval for a treatment for PTSD, psychedelic therapy is on track to become the next major breakthrough in mental health care. MAPS Canada, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, has supported studies to develop psychedelics into safe and legal medical treatments since its formation in 2008. Currently, MAPS Canada is funding 2 separate studies on MDMA and cognitive processing therapy as a treatment for PTSD. Additionally, plans to fund studies that identify psychedelic treatments for eating disorders and others that involve ibogaine are in the works. To conduct and publish scientific research and education supporting the beneficial use of psychedelic medicines, MAPS Canada relies on public donations and fundraising initiatives. The funds raised from this webinar series will go to fund this research. For more information on MAPS Canada, please see our website at mapscanada.org. So today we are going to start from a talk from our guest, Wade Davis, who is joining us. After that, we will start our Q&A session. So just a few housekeeping reminders. We have the Ask a Question in the bottom there. As we can see, we already have 2 questions in there. Make sure and vote up your questions because we will be prioritizing those. And feel free to type in the chat. Let us know where you're tuning in from. It looks like we have people from all over the world here. We have Vancouver. We have Steamboat Springs, Colorado. We have Tofino, Lake of the Woods, Santa Cruz. We have Horseshoe Bay, Dallas, Texas. Another from Bowen Island, Brazil, Ottawa, Hollywood. We have Michigan. We have Hawaii Island, New Brunswick, Toronto, Amsterdam. So make sure and let us know where you are tuning in from today. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Wade Davis. Wade Davis is a writer, photographer, and filmmaker whose work has taken him from the Amazon to Tibet to Africa to Australia, Polynesia to the Arctic. Explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society from 2000 to 2013, he is currently Professor of Anthropology and the BC Leadership Chair in Cultures and Ecosystems at Risk at the University of British Columbia. Author of 22 books, including One River, The Wayfinders, and Into Silence. Winner of the 2012 Samuel Johnson Prize, the top nonfiction prize in the English language. He holds degrees in anthropology and biology and received his PhD in ethnobotany from the Harvard University. His many film credits include Light at the Edge of the World, an 8-hour documentary series written and produced for the NGS. David, one of 20 honorary members of the Explorers Club, is the recipient of 12 honorary degrees, as well as the 2009 Gold Medal from the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, the 2011 Explorers Medal, the 2012 David Fairchild Medal for Botanical Exploration, the 2015 Centennial Medal of Harvard University, the 2017 Roy Chapman Andrews Society Distinguished Explorer Award, the 2017 Sir Christopher Ondaatje Medal for Exploration, and the 2018 Mungo Park Medal from the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. In 2016, he was made a member of the Order of Canada. In 2018, he became an honorary citizen of Colombia. His latest book, Magdalena, River of Dreams, will be published by Knopf in September 2020. And as you might have also seen, Wade just wrote a piece for Rolling Stone that went viral with over 200 million social media impressions. So without any further ado, help me welcome Wade Davis. So great to have you with us today, Wade.
It's great to be with you. You might want to do a little check before my you go.
Wade, could you turn the volume down on your computer a little bit, please?
Let's see.
How we doing now? I think we're doing better. Can we hear your voice?
Is that better?
A little bit.
How's that?
That
I think
sounds
we're
better.
good.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's very low. Is that very low or is that okay?
that's
Your
perfect.
voice sounds fine. Your voice sounds totally fine. Yeah.
Okay, how about that? Is that good?
That's okay.
Great.
One more notch down. Do you mind?
No, not at all.
Sorry.
How's that?
I think that'll be okay.
Okay, good. Well, thank you,
Wonderful.
Shannon.
Thanks so much for being here, especially with all that you have going on right now.
Well, it's my pleasure. You know, it's interesting. In this entire renaissance of psychedelics, you know, it's made me think of how if you just live long enough, you become kind of an elder. And my good friend Dennis McKenna and I always joke about this. And of course, Dennis has maintained his focus on the psychedelic movement from really deservingly becoming a kind of a godfather of that movement. And, you know, I slipped into it at a very young age and wrote a great deal about it. But in a certain sense, I was more like Ram Dass. You know, I sort of got the message and I hung up. But the reason I mention that is that you know, the way one explores the use of these substances really depends on the needs and of the individual. But I would say this. Even though I am today not an active user of these substances, I very proudly said that not only did I use them, they changed my life. I wouldn't write the way I write. I wouldn't think the way I think. I wouldn't have understood the basic lessons of anthropology, cultural relativism. I wouldn't have related to men the way I do or the way I relate to women. I wouldn't relate to the natural world. I wouldn't have become a botanist, perhaps, had I not had my imagination sort of opened up, the breaking of the veil, if you will. And so I find it very interesting that when we look back on the dramatic social changes over the last 40 years, 50 years, women going from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay people from the closet to the altar, new attitudes towards the environment. You know, when I was a kid, just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was an environmental victory. Nobody spoke of the biosphere or biodiversity. Now these are terms that are part of the vernacular of the school child. And it's curious that when we look at that wave of change, which I think many of us would feel was all for the best, the one ingredient that we sort of consistently expunge from the record is that millions of us lay prostrate before the gates of awe, having taken some sacred medicine. And, you know, it's interesting how our parents back in the day would always say to us, you know, don't take these things, you'll never come back the same. And of course, that was the entire bloody point. And I say all that as a preamble to the presentation I want to share with you this afternoon, because we all sit on the shoulders of our predecessors. And a lot of young people may look up to friends of ours like Andy Weil or Dennis McKenna or many of the leading figures who have been so thoughtful in thinking about these medicines over the years. We, of course, ourselves very much are the children of a cadre of characters that were not just pioneers, but they were utter visionaries. And what they inspired was a shattering of the Western mind, in a sense. And they opened the door for the rest of us to move through into other realms of realization. And that's really what I'd like to share this afternoon, the story of this early cadre of explorers who went looking for these sacred medicines, but critically in a context where there had been no psychedelic revolution. There had been no, you know, popularization of these substances. They remained extraordinarily obscure, virtually unknown to the public. And yet here was this extraordinary group of eclectic individuals who together would change history. So maybe I can just jump right in there and bring up the images if I could.
Absolutely. I'm just going to pop off the screen here, and I just got a message from our tech support. Just for volume and the echo, they're asking if you can just turn it down 2 more notches to be safe. There's a little bit of reverb on it.
Yeah. And how's that? Because what if I go any lower, I'm going to have no audio. I can turn off my audio altogether if you want. If
we're good to go. That sounds great, Wade. Thank you.
Does that sound better?
That sounds, yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, great. Thanks. I apologize to everybody for the...
No problem.
Well, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, there was one man who loomed large over the Harvard campus, a kindly professor who shot blowguns in class and kept outside his door a bucket of peyote buttons available to his students as an optional laboratory experiment. In time, national parks would bear his name, as would protected areas. Prince Philip would call him the father of the Amazon. Students would know him as the authority on medicinal, toxic, and hallucinogenic plants, the botanical explorer who had sparked the psychedelic era with his discovery, first of the wonder of peyote amongst the Kiowa in Oklahoma, and later through unraveling the mysteries of 2 ancient Aztec sacred plants, Tehuantecatl, flesh of the gods, and Ololuiki, the serpent god. And then having identified those sacred plants in Mexico, Schultz in 1941 would take a leave of absence from the university and disappear into the Northwest Amazon, where he remained for 12 uninterrupted years, traveling down unknown rivers, living amongst unknown peoples, all the time enchanted by the wonder of the tropical rainforest. And in time, he came to understand the rhythm of that forest, unlike any person before him. And for his students, the small eclectic cadre who gravitated to his shadow and walked in it at the Botanical Museum, he was kind of a living link to a distant era when those forests stood immense, inviolable, a kind of mantle of green that covered the entire continent. But he was an odd choice to become a 60s icon because his politics were wildly conservative. It's true that he had led the legendary writer William Burroughs into the Northwest Amazon, the Upper Putumayo, in 1953, but he also had disowned TimothyLeary at Harvard for bastardizing the sacred Latin language by using the term psychedelic, when any Harvard man loyal to the classics would know that the proper orthography and pronunciation would have been psychodelic. Schultz's politics on the surface were kind of radically conservative, neither Democratic or Republican. He professed not to believe in the American Revolution, and there was always one written-in vote in his community for Queen Elizabeth II. In fact, one of his colleagues once remarked that the only way for Professor Schultz to quote-unquote go native would be to go to London. It was said that when Jackie Onassis visited the Botanical Museum, he literally hid out in a cupboard for several hours to avoid having to guide her through the exhibits. Now, these stubborn political convictions that were sort of, in a sense, carried upon him like a cloak through the influence of his father and his own academic mentor, the great orchidologist Oakes Ames, belied the fundamental decency and kindness of the man. And in fact, he was less conservative than totally libertarian on issues of personal choice and freedom, whether it was sexual orientation, abortion, the use of drugs, religious beliefs, the human rights of indigenous people. He was a complete and utter libertarian. And his devotion to students was truly legendary. And for years, it's hard to imagine today, in an era of decriminalization and legalization of marijuana in Canada, how draconian the sanctions were for the use of this humble herb in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. But of course, a young student caught with marijuana could have his or her life ruined. And Schultz found that absolutely appalling. And so he set up a mission to get students off marijuana convictions. And it went like this. By legal statute in the United States in particular, the government said that cannabis sativa was illegal. But Schultz and a small minority of botanists maintained that there were in fact 3 species of cannabis, including indica and ruderalis. And therefore that left the burden of proof in a criminal proceeding on the prosecution to show that a ground up bag of pot was in fact sativa as opposed to one of its botanical relatives. Now, since even the botanists couldn't agree on how many species there were, after all, this was a plant that had been used for 4,000 years as a food, a medicine, a narcotic, a stimulant, an oil, etc. It was virtually impossible for the prosecution to prove a case. Now, none of the students understood these arcane points of botanical nomenclature, but they most assuredly appreciated the wonderful old professor's ability to break open the courtrooms and set the students free. Well, Schultz's life began in a very conservative milieu in East Boston. He was from a poor family. He was the first of his family to go to university. The parents couldn't afford the cost of dormitories, and so he lived in his yellow tenement in East Boston and commuted to the campus. And he took a job just to make money, filing cards at 13 cents an hour in the most eclectic library, perhaps in North America at the time. And this was the library, the Economic Botany Library in the Botanical Museum. And in between these sort of monographs of distant tribes and these herbals of legendary botanists from Brunfels to Linnaeus, these accounts of these curious plants like Louis Lewin's Fantastica, Schultz, in a sense, fell away into trance. And he took the course that had been taught longer at Harvard than any other, and it was called Plants and Human Affairs. Now, his professor, Oakes Ames, was equally iconoclastic, equally libertarian, with a great contempt for federal regulations and the federal government. And so throughout Prohibition, one of the laboratory assignments of the students in that class had been to ferment and distill copious amounts of alcohol and sample those preparations liberally in the laboratory. Essentially, the lab was all about getting slightly lubricated. And yet when it came time for the plants that were then known as the Fantastica, even Professor Ames had his limitations. And so the students had to do a book report. And Schultz had so much other homework that he raced to the back of the lab and he selected the thinnest book he possibly could amongst the selected offerings. And he put it into his satchel and he went home to East Boston. And that night, as he took this book out of his satchel, botanical history was made, because a thin volume that he just happened to have taken was none other than Henrik Kluver's account, Mescal, the Divine Plant and its Psychological Effects. Published in 1928, it was the only monograph then available in the English language that described the stunning pharmacological effects of peyote. And all night long, Schultz stayed up and he read of these accounts of visions of orb-like brilliance and miasmas of blue and purple smoke coming down over the imagination, sweeping and transforming the human consciousness. And simply astonished that a plant could do such things, he approached his professor Ames the next day, and he said, I must understand this plant. I must study it. And he asked permission to study peyote for his undergraduate thesis. Now, Ames was an incredible man. And he said, you can study it, but on one condition. First of all, you read everything you can about it, but then you must actually know the plant. And so Schultz dug into the literature and discovered that the plant had most likely originated in the Sierra Madre Occidental in northwest Mexico, perhaps amongst the Tarahumara, the famous runners of the mountains. These were individuals who would carry the postal mail for the Mexican government, people who would run dozens and dozens of miles without slowing down, protected by a girdle of peyote and a girdle of eagle claws. And then he discovered that peyote had probably moved from the Tarahumara into the realm of the Huichol. And the Huichol would go on these great pilgrimages to the land of the sacred deer. And the metaphor was so remarkable. You didn't simply gather peyote, you hunted it, because in the same spirit with which a hunter embraces prey, knowing full well that he must kill the thing he loves most, that fundamental confrontation with death, which was a genesis of all religious aspiration. So the metaphor is that you have to move through sacred geography, entering a liminal space where communion with the divine can be possible. And so the people, the Huichol, would spend days and days on the trail. And then as they reached the regions of the desert where the cactus could be found, they would literally stalk it and shoot it with sacred arrows. And all of these accounts that were brought forward by scholars of an earlier generation simply enchanted Schultz. And then he read that the peyote had reached the American plains through the Comanche and through this extraordinary man, Quanoparca. And once it reached the American plains, it spread with an extraordinary rate of diffusion. And it did so not as a stimulant of the great culture, but rather as something that, in the wake of the collapse of the great civilization of the American plains, peyote offered a kind of a pharmacological shortcut to distant metaphysical realms that had been traditionally achieved by the ordeal, by the vision quest, by the ingestion of the toxic mescal beans, and it offered in the same sense that the ghost dance religion, with its sort of messianic hope that the whites would be eliminated from the plains and the buffalo would come back in their great numbers. It came about in the wake of the collapse of the great civilization of the plains. And so in doing so, of course, it had an extraordinary rate of diffusion of virtually a society every year, until the Native American church would eventually embrace peoples as far north as the Cree in Canada. Now Schultz went to Ames, and Ames promised him that he could get a small grant that he, in fact, came out of his own pocket. And with that money, and having connected with an extraordinary graduate student at Yale by the name of Weston LeBar, Schultz, in the summer of 1933, in this 1928 Studebaker that Weston had traded a train ticket for, he and LeBar found themselves bouncing over the dusty roads of Tennessee, heading west to Indian country in Oklahoma, where they would embrace the peyote cult and take the sacred medicine 4 and 5 nights a week for 2 months of their young lives. For 2 months, as Schultz would write, time turned into color, thoughts unleashed sounds, gestures became rainbows of light. And his teachers had names like Charlie Charcoal, Heeple Bears, and Mary Buffalo. And he entered their lives, and he became a member of the last generation of outside scholars who actually knew the Kiowa elders who had lived the great culture of the plains, a way of life that had withered and died within a century of its birth. Unlike the Sioux, with their memories of having been agriculturalists The Kiowa had no memory of ever being anything but hunters. They were mythologically born in the belly of a cottonwood log at the headwaters of the Missouri River. Around the time of the American Revolution, they made their way down to the Great Plains, where they met the Crow, who taught them the culture of the plain, the hunting of buffalo, the divinity of the sun. And then they moved into the Black Hills, where they fought with Lakota, and then retreated across the headwaters of the Arkansas River to the southern plains, where they met the Comanche, did battle with the Comanche, then formed an alliance with the Comanche that gave them complete hegemony over the southern plains. The Kiowa would kill more white people than any other society per capita, own more horses than any other society, and it was through the Comanche and the Kiowa that what would become the Peyote cult moved and dispersed across the North American continent. And so for him to work with a woman like Mary Buffalo, here was a woman who as a child had grown up to believe in the divinity of the sun. At the annual Sundance, she had watched as the sacred arbor was built over the rawhide box within which was the tiny symbol of the sun, where there'd be buffalo robes at the base, buffalo skulls that would then open to a semicircle, a horseshoe of teepees, at the mouth of which three men would stand throughout the entire Sundance, following the sun from morning to night, literally physically sacrificing their vision so that metaphorically people would learn to see in the coming year. She grew old as a woman in the shadow of a silenced world. Remember that the buffalo, which in 1871 outnumbered people in North America, individual herds had grazing areas the size of the state of Rhode Island. And from the height of their population to their reduction to but a shadow in the prairie, a zoological curiosity, was not decades as a consequence of the inexorable progression of the American frontier. It was 7 years, and it was explicit policy of the U.S. cavalry to eliminate the commissary, the food of the nations of the Great Plains. And when the last of the buffalo was reduced to a shadow in the prairie, and the last of the great nations were reduced to servitude in the reservations, Philip Sheridan, the Civil War general who orchestrated that campaign, recommended to the U.S. Congress that a commemorative medal be minted that would have on the one side of it a dead buffalo and the other side of it a dead Indian. And so Schultz was in this remarkable position to actually know the culture of the plains and to take peyote and to listen to the chants. And you would never so much as gather that this next photograph, here you can see in this image that he took in 1933, the Thunderbird altar, the path of the Peyote way, men and women embracing the sacrament in these extraordinary healing ceremonies. You'd never know that the man on the left of this photograph, who hasn't the hair out of place and has his red Harvard tie still tightly around his neck, that he has just come out of a ceremony, a nocturnal ceremony that has sent a dozen Kiowa on a collective journey to the divine. Well, with Wassen Labar, and Schultz would return to Boston, needless to say, a student transformed. He became a supporter of not just the rights of the indigenous people, but of the integrity of the Native American Church itself. In February of 1937, he traveled to Washington to testify successfully against Senate Bill 1399, which was just the latest effort to outlaw the religious practices of the Kiowa. And when he wrote his undergraduate thesis on the use of peyote, its history, its ethnobotany, its role in religion, he wrote that peyote, by the use of peyote, the indigenous people are, quote, able to absorb God's spirit in the same way that white Christians absorb the spirit by means of sacramental bread and wine. Well, that was a very bold idea in the spring of 1937, particularly for a young lad from East Boston who, until he went to Oklahoma Territory, had never been west of the Charles River. And yet that was just the beginning. Because while he was in Washington working on peyote, he stumbled upon the clue that would allow him to go on to solve the greatest mystery in the history of ethnobotany. And that was the identity of the two long-lost sacred plants, Tehuanacatl, flesh of the gods in Nahuatl, the language of the Aztec, and Ololuiki, the serpent vine. Now, critically, a very prominent anthropologist at Smithsonian by the name of William Safford had gone on record to say that Tehuanacatl was in fact peyote, and that Ololuiki was in fact datura. Now, Schultz didn't know much at that time about datura, Jimson weed, or the jaguar's intoxicant, or the tree of the evil eagle, but he would in time. But he did know something about peyote, and he was absolutely certain that peyote was not the plant that the Spaniards, in all of their precision, because the early Spanish chroniclers had been extraordinary botanists. Remember then that a physician was a botanist by definition. He was convinced that peyote could not possibly have been Tehuanacatl. And yet he had no proof, and he couldn't go up against this man Safford until by chance, as he looked at herbarium specimens of peyote in the National Herbarium, he stumbled upon a letter attached to the specimen of peyote that had been addressed to the late director of the National Herbarium, a man by the name of Rose. And it had been written by an obscure German called Blas Pablo Reco from Guadalajara. And it is dated as early as 1923, more than a decade before Schultz stumbled upon it. And the letter said very simply, I understand your man Safford says that Tehuanacatl is peyote. It's not, he's a fool, it's a mushroom, and I've seen it used. Well, Schultz was astonished by this, and having jumped off one Greyhound bus from Tulsa because the Studebaker broke down, he immediately leapt on another one for Mexico City. And he found himself in July of 1938, little more than a year before the outbreak of the Second World War, traveling south to Oaxaca, his destination, the small Mazatec town of Huautla, with this man, B.P. Reco, as his companion. And as they went south, Schultz had a couple of moments of revelation. First of all, he turned to a little Mazatec woman beside him on the train, and trying to practice his Spanish, he asked her very politely, Señora, ¿cuántos años tiene? And by leaving off the tilde on the ñ, he had inadvertently asked her how many anuses she had. And with great surprise, she turned to him and said, solamente uno, señor, as if he might have more than one asshole. But at the same time, and far more profoundly, he found that B.P. Reco was in fact an ardent Nazi. And so here he was on the eve of Hitler's war, traveling into the Mazatec country with an ardent Nazi as his companion. Now, to make things even more interesting, it turned out that there was another team of investigators that summer descending on the same little Mazatec village, which, of course, those of you who know it today know that it has grown enormously. But here it is as Schultz encountered it in 1938. And this other team was led by Bernard Bevan, who was the brother of Ernst Bevan, who would serve in Churchill's cabinet during World War II. And Bernard Bevan, by reputation and rumor, was British Secret Service. And with him was a young American anthropologist by the name of Jean Bassett Johnson, an anthropology student from Berkeley. So you have this scenario right out of Indiana Jones of these two teams descending on this small village, both of them in search of the botanical origins of Tehuanacatl, the flesh of the gods. Well, on the night of July 16th, 1938, Johnson and Bevan did become the first outsiders to attend a vigil in which mushrooms were in fact ingested by an old curandera as part of a complex healing ceremony. But they didn't know what the source of the sacrament actually was. Clearly, they knew that it was a vehicle for divination, but neither man in their party had actually ingested the mushroom in sacred context. And more importantly, none of them had secured botanical specimens for as vouchers for a precise scientific identification. But they did reveal clearly, to their credit, that mushrooms were used in sacred context and had been for a very long time. The next breakthrough came when Professor Schultz was approached by the town merchant, a man called Dorantes, who suddenly unfolded a small little kerchief, inside of which were a dozen or more small little specimens of psilocybes, of sacred mushrooms. And he called them the saint children, the little ones who spring forth. So here was definitive proof that Tehuacatl was in fact a mushroom, as some of the early Spanish chronicles had said. And so in February 21st of 1939, Schultz reported his discovery, and needless to say, in a world moving quickly to global conflict, a paper that was entitled Plantae Mexicana Dos, the identification of Tehuacatl, a narcotic basidiomycete of the Aztecs, did not receive wide circulation. But Schultz, undeterred, returned to Oaxaca the next year, this time in pursuit of the identity of the mysterious psychoactive substance ololoiki. And it turned out that ololoiki was in fact not a datura, as Safford had said, but was itself a morning glory, very common to our domesticated varieties. And at that point, Schultz, having identified the actual botanical source of these sacred plants, at that point the war intervened, and the thread of the research was not picked up until after the war. During the war, many of the main characters in the saga disappeared. Reiko was murdered on the streets of Mexico City. Johnson, sadly, was killed during the American invasions of North Africa in 1942. And it was only in the wake of the war that Schultz, who had just come back from the Amazon, was contacted by another great figure in this grand saga, Gordon Wassen, and his wife Valentina Pavlovna. And Gordon Wassen at the time was a banker and vice president of J.P. Morgan and Company in New York, but married to a Russian, and the Russians are famously fungophiles. They love mushrooms. Wassen, as an amateur scholar of great precision, had concocted the idea that somewhere in the world there was a people who worshipped mushrooms. He didn't know where or how, and he would later distill those ideas in his great monograph on soma, Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric, which he thought was the botanical origin of the great healing and sacred medicine of the Vedic scriptures, soma. But he thought that somewhere in alive today, there might be a people who use those mushrooms in ritual context. He didn't know where or how or why, but he just had an inclination based on his research. And somehow, just as Wassens were trying to prove that assertion in September of 1952, he received a letter from the poet Robert Graves on Majorca, who had somehow stumbled upon Schultz's 1939 paper and his later paper in the American Anthropologist in 1940. He contacted Schultz, and Schultz encouraged him to return to or to travel to Oaxaca and work with his main informant, Maria Salina. And so Wassen, with his wife and a photographer, Alan Richardson, and another individual who would later turn out to have been a plant by the CIA, embarked on a series of expeditions. And it took 3 seasons to establish the rapport that actually allowed them to be finally invited to partake of the sacred medicine in ritual context. And this photograph was taken on that night of June 29th, 1955, when Wassen and Richardson became the first outsiders ever to take mushrooms in a sacred context. And again, I stress that, those of us who were kind of nursed on the psychedelic era, whether it was through the music of Sgt. Pepper or the books like The Door by Huxley, or the kind of pageantry and carnival exaltations of TimothyLeary, or just the fact that our friends were taking acid down the street, forget that there was a time when all of this was unknown and all of this was exploratory. And so for Wassen to experience the mushrooms for the first time, he was very much on his own. And it was, as he wrote, an utterly soul-shattering experience. And he wrote something very beautiful in his journal that night. He said, "We are all confined within the prison walls of our everyday vocabulary. With skill in our choice of words, we may stretch accepted meanings to cover slightly new feelings. But when a state of mind is utterly distinct, then our words fail. How can you tell a man who has been blind what it is like to see?" And I think that is a wonderful early distillation of something that all of us feel when we take these sacred medicines, this transcendent intuition that the world unveiled by these sacred plants is not a world of hallucinations, but rather is the real world, and that the mundane realm in which that we inhabit for most of our lives is just sort of a crude facsimile of a world that lies beyond these, the other dimensions of reality. Now, Wassen wrote up his experience, and I mean, it tells you how innocent all of this was. And it was long before any of this had fallen under the rubric of the war on drugs, the demonization of the use of these substances that began with Nixon largely. It was just simply a curious thing. And it wasn't unusual that even as they put this guy, Burt Lair, who had played, if you remember, the lion in The Wizard of Oz, a Hollywood star on the cover of Life magazine, with this little aside, Great Adventures 3, the discovery of mushrooms that cause strange vision. Right above this crisis of the era, what do we do with teenage allowances? And of course, an editor picked a snappy title, and the title was, of course, Seeking the Magic Mushroom. The name stuck, and the psychedelic gold rush, if you will, was on. And the next challenge scientifically was to find out what on earth it was that caused such a profound shift in consciousness. And a number of efforts were made in North America to no avail to identify the active ingredient. And so finally, in collaboration with Schultz, Wassen sent 64 mushrooms to this man, Albert Hoffman, who was working at the time in the Sandoz research laboratories in Basel. Hoffman began by feeding half of the mushrooms to his dog, and nothing happened. And so he ate the other half, 32 mushrooms, and something did happen. The landscape outside of his window in Switzerland began to look like Mexico. The pencil in his laboratory assistant's hand began to look like an obsidian blade, and he feared that he'd be swept away into the whirlwind by the whirlwind of color that had flooded over his imagination. Now, such as he wrote, after 90 minutes of taking the mushrooms, he wrote that the rush of abstract motifs reached such an alarming degree that I feared I would be torn into this whirlpool of form and color and would simply dissolve. Well, such a experience might have unnerved an ordinary scientist, but of course, as you all know, Albert Hofmann was never ordinary. For more than a decade, he had been experimenting with lysergic acid, the fundamental building block of the series of chemicals responsible for St. Anthony's fire. This was a strange phenomenon that had been reported since the Middle Ages, where small little villages in France and Italy would suddenly go mad. Individuals would have their tissue become necrotic. The tips of fingers, the tip of a nose would simply rot and fall off, and people would go mad. Well, it turned out that the active ingredient in this was derived from a fungal parasite of rye crops, which had polluted the flour of the bread. And these outbreaks would sometimes result in the death of hundreds of people, and others who survived would experience horrific hallucinations and go mad. And of course, the drug in question was a very powerful vasoconstrictor, hence the gangrene in the extremities. And it was exactly this property that Hofmann had been experimenting with, because the drug had a huge potential, ergobasine, in the treatment of women who hemorrhaged after childbirth. And he had been working on these indole alkaloids for over a decade. And back in the war, he of course had famously gone to make the 25th of a series of analogs of the indole group when he suddenly began to get dizzy, and he felt he had no choice but to go home and rest. And because of the wartime shortages of gas, he was bicycling back and forth to his lab. And on his return home that afternoon to rest, of course, he went on one of the most momentous bicycle rides in history, because the compound he had been experimenting with, a trace of which had accidentally seeped in through his skin, was none other than lysergic acid diethylamide 25, arguably the most potent hallucinogenic agent ever synthesized or ever discovered. And of course, it was his job to learn how to synthesize it. And so on his ride home, Dr. Hofmann went on the world's first acid trip. So Hofmann was quite prepared for the onslaught of visual stimuli that resulted from the ingestion of the mushrooms, and he very quickly identified the active ingredients, and in March of 1958 announced the discovery of psilocybin and psilocin, the two substances which turned out to be very closely related molecularly to serotonin. All were tryptamines, serotonin being a compound that plays a vital role, of course, in brain chemistry. But here's where it got interesting. When he turned to Schultz's samples of Olorwiki, the serpent vine, what he discovered was barely believable. The active ingredients were compounds that he already had sitting on the shelf of his lab, and they differed from LSD only by the replacement of two hydrogen atoms for two ethyl groups. So in a certain sense, 4 years before Hofmann discovered or synthesized LSD in the laboratory in 1943, Richard Evans Schultz had found its analog in nature in the seeds of a humble morning glory long worshipped as a god incarnate by the ancient peoples of Central America. Now, by this point, of course, I should just add here that as that article of Gordon Wassen's came out in Life magazine, two men in Cambridge, Massachusetts, subscribed to that magazine, TimothyLeary and Richard Alpert. Now, Richard Alpert, of course, would go on to become Ram Dass, and in the spirit that I first mentioned my own experiences, he very much sort of got the message and hung up. And this, if you read or if you're a fan of the Beatles, This is very much what George Harrison went through, or Paul McCartney for that matter. You know, you take acid, you get the message, and then you seek that world through other means, which is a completely legitimate use. And it's not to denigrate those who find the use of these substances an ongoing part of their practice. Remember, there's no such thing as good and bad drugs, if you want to use that term. There are only good and bad ways of using these substances. TimothyLeary took a different path. You know, there had been Albert was well established at Harvard. Leary was less academically established, but in many ways, I think Albert would agree, and Ram Dass once said this to me, that it was Tim who really was the brilliant mind of the two of them. And there had been a study that had come out in psychology that had said that no matter what the psychiatric ailment, no matter what the intervention, roughly a third of people got better, a third stayed the same, and a third got worse. And so right when TimothyLeary, as a very prominent and insightful social psychologist, had this sort of crisis, professional crisis of his career with that research revelation, suddenly hears about these substances that can take you into another realm. And indeed, he made his own beeline for Cuernavaca and took the mushrooms and came back, like everybody does, a man transformed. Now, it's important to note that, yes, TimothyLeary, with the legendary expression, turn on, tune in, drop out, became, in a sense, a proselytizer. He became a bit of a barker. He was very much an advocate, and that naturally brought down the wrath of the government, the ire of older generations. But we have to remember that this man was a very serious scholar, and the way he was treated was simply atrocious. Few people who know the story of TimothyLeary seem to remember that the Nixon government put him in jail in solitary confinement for months at a time at a maximum security prison, San Quentin, for the crime of having in his possession one joint of marijuana. So again, you know, I think we have to look back on these men and women who really paved the way for this renaissance that we're anticipating, and many of us are participating in today. And you can only ask yourself, what would have happened had the potential of these substances been more properly acknowledged, more openly heralded at the time of their first sort of quote unquote discovery by the West. Remember that if you look at the work of the memoirs of Ehrlichman, Nixon's one of Nixon's two main figures with Haldeman in the Nixon White House, in his memoir, Ehrlichman says very directly, we had no interest in drug use or not drug use. We just saw it as a leverage point. We knew that the way we could secure the support of what would later be called the silent majority in Nixon's term, there were two issues, drug use and race. And they deliberately set out to make those the pivotal issues of the 1968 campaign, even if it meant ruining the lives of many, many people. Well, of course, as this was all unfolding, Schultz had already returned from 12 years in South America. And those years had been extraordinary. Again, in one of those really serendipitous moments in the history of science, when he received his PhD based on his work in Oaxaca, Schultz had two options. He could have become a schoolmaster at a boarding school in New England, or he could take an offer from the National Research Council to travel to South America to try to search for the botanical origins of curare, the flying death, the arrow poisons of legendary lore. Now, at this time in 1943, the medical utility of curare had been realized. It was a muscle relaxant that could be used in conjunction with anesthetics to reduce the amount of anesthesia necessary in surgical procedures, which was of huge interest. And yet, even as those medical advances were being made at McGill University, nobody knew the botanical source of what we now know to be at least 90 species that have this curious property. So Schultz's mission was to go to South America and search initially for the botanical sources of the flying death. And he carried in his imagination the great adage of Paracelsus, who had said always that the difference between a poison, a medicine, and a narcotic was simply dosage. And in that sense, he was looking for any plant that had biodynamic properties. And this brought him invariably into the realm of the shaman. He arrived in Bogota, incidentally, in the fall of 1941, when the tallest building in the great Colombian capital was a spire in the church at on the Plaza Santander. He made his way to the homeland of the Kamsa and the Ingano in the upper reaches of the Putumayo. He fell into the orbit of an extraordinary curandero, Salvador Sindo, whose deportment, his clothing, is a conscious attempt to mimic the costumes of the visionary beings encountered when the shaman ingests ayahuasca, the vision vine. Within a month of being in the highland valley of Sibundoy, Schultz would find no fewer than 4 new hallucinogenic plants previously unreported by science. He counted over 1,600 individual hallucinogenic trees, including this rare cultivar that he originally called Methyscodendron. He thought it was, in fact, a new genus of the tree Datura, held in the hands of a young boy who, as an old man, would become one of my mentors in the valley of Sibundoy. And he saw the power of these plants, these extraordinary intoxicants. The tree daturas, never found in the wild, always found in association with human habitation. Plants that induce a state of psychotic delirium, visions of hellfire, a burning thirst, visions of flight, total amnesia. And in fact, some suggest that the hexing herbs of Europe, henbane, belladonna, with these same tropane alkaloids, may have been related either literally or metaphorically with the witch on the broomstick at Halloween, because these drugs, of course, are topically active, and an effective way for a woman to absorb them is through the moist tissue of the genitalia. Whether that story is true or apocryphal, it's simply too delicious a tale not to tell at the next gathering of parents at the PTA on the eve of Halloween. But Schultz had, in his work with Salvador Sindo, the first of many revelations. And what made him unique is that he didn't go into these communities as a scholar. He went as a student. He recognized intuitively that they were the masters. Also, he was, in many instances in the 1940s, the first outsider that societies had encountered who wasn't there to steal their land, who wasn't there to transform their religious ideas, who wasn't there to exploit their labor or their families, their children, their daughters in particular. He was simply a solitary student of plants who was there to learn what they knew at their feet, by their grace. And for the indigenous people, this was kind of the most reasonable thing they had ever heard from an outsider, because why wouldn't an outsider come to understand and to learn of the remarkable botanical lore, which was a foundation not only of their knowledge, but also of their ability to survive, living, of course, upon the wealth and the bounty of the forest that they would come to understand so well. And he came to understand that they were not a people to do things in half measures. As he slipped from Mocoa, from Sibundoy down towards Mocoa, amongst the Ingano, he discovered a new genus of plant in the Sapindaceae family that the indigenous people, the Ingano, called yoko. And every morning they would rasp the bark and make a cold water decoction of the milky latex. and knock back their calabash. And within minutes, the fingertips and toe tips would become numb. And Schultz hypothesized that the liana had caffeine in it. He was right. It had a lot of caffeine. He would later ascertain that in knocking back their single calabash of yoko, the indigenous people were knocking back in a single blast the equivalent of 20 cups of coffee. As I say, they were not people to do things in half measures. And on this very first journey, he would also stumble upon one of the most extraordinary discoveries of his career. He, of course, both amongst the Ngano and the Kamsa, and further down as he reached the homeland of the Kofan, arguably the most sophisticated manipulators of plants in the Northwest Amazon. We now know, for example, that the Kofan had had networks of trade that brought admixtures for both arrow poisons and for ayahuasca from hundreds of kilometers away in the forest. And the plant, of course, ayahuasca, or yahe, as it was known in Colombia, had long been a celebrated hallucinogen, reported for the first time in the 19th century by Schultz's great hero, the legendary British botanist Richard Spruce. Spruce had reported that yahe was the embodiment of the jaguar, a magical intoxicant capable of freeing the soul, allowing it to wander to mystical encounters with ancestors and spirit animals and spirit beings. And the shaman would say in the early years, and Spruce recorded this, that when people took the sacred medicine, collective visions were possible, which is one of the reasons that the active ingredient, harmaline, when first isolated, was called by Colombian scientists telepathine. But what Schultz encountered was not simply a powerful plant, as had been the case of, say, peyote in among the Kiowa or Tehuantepecatl amongst the Mazatec. Here was a level of botanical alchemy of a sort that was not only had never been reported, but was beyond all of his imaginings. And it began on February 28, 1942, when he collected woody liana for the first time, and he recorded these notes. He said, yahe is taken often by some, infrequently by others. It's a violent purge, a vomitive, extremely bitter. Some effects are exhilaration, a feeling of ease and well-being. Others say it is a day of discomfort. The bark is scraped off and small pieces are heated in the water. The water is drunk. People take it alone or in small groups, often with someone about to be cured. The curandero takes yahe to see the proper herb or herbs the sick person needs. Now, here's a critical line. I remember, 1942, usually taken alone, but in Puerto Limon, it is taken sometimes together with the bark of another vine, the chagropanga. It is said to be almost the same leaf, but a harder and stouter vine. Now, Schultz at the time wasn't sure what to make of this, but two things immediately impressed him. First was the realization that the healer embraced yahe both as a visionary medium and itself as a teacher. The plant made the diagnosis. It was a living being, and the Ngano and the Kamsa acknowledged its magical and sacred resonance as reflexively as he accepted the axioms of his own science. Yet even more importantly, here was evidence of a level of empirical experimentation of a specificity that he had never before encountered. In Oklahoma and Mexico, and more recently amongst the Kamsa, he had always taken psychoactive plants alone, not in combination. And now his Kofan and Ngano informants were suggesting that you could actually manipulate the ingredients of a preparation by adding a plant called chagropanga, and that somehow this would affect the nature of the experience. Now, Schultz didn't question the indigenous people. He just elected to test their preparations on himself. And so he drank an infusion derived solely from the bark of the liana, Banisteriopsis capi, and the visions that came were blue and purple, slow, undulating waves of color. But then a few days later, he tried it with Chagrapanga, and the effect was electric. Reds and golds dazzling and diamonds that turned like dancers on the tips of distant highways. That's actually a line from my book, One River. I must have been on something when I wrote it. But anyway, the point is that if Yahe alone, he discovered, felt like a kind of a slow turning of the sky, the addition of Chagrapanga caused explosions of passion and visions and dreams that collapsed one into another until in the empty morning, only the birds remained scarlet and crimson against the rising sun. And what he discovered was a bit of alchemy that in its complexity and sophistication had no equal in the Amazon. Now he's open to this because he had seen what the indigenous people could do. Here, for example, in this image, the use of these curious ichthyotoxins that are simply pounded by bodies of water, placed into the water. The toxins interfere with respiration in the gills of the fish. The fish are stunned and can be readily harvested. These plants, of course, yielded rotenone, or most important, biodegradable insecticide. And of course, in the realm of the shaman, he had also seen the use of admixtures in these incredible arrow poisons. So he knew that the indigenous people were true natural philosophers who manipulated their plants with a level of kind of precision of equal to a laboratory scientist. But the ayahuasca combination was something very special indeed. And we now know, of course, through the work of Dennis McKenna in particular, how this was all unfolding. Many of you, of course, will know that the active ingredients in the shrubs that are used as admixtures, Psychotria viridis, or in the other liana that is an admixture, Diploteris cavriana, contain tryptamines. And tryptamines are the same substances that Schultz would later discover being used amongst the Yanomami, for example, in the forests of the upper Orinoco in Venezuela. And these tryptamines that are generally used as vegetable snuffs also derive from Adenanthera, Wilca, some of the seeds in the bean family. These powders are full of tryptamines, and they have to be injected, smoked, or snuffed because tryptamines are orally inactive. Schultz wasn't quite aware of this at the time, but it would later be revealed that the ingestion orally of tryptamines has no impact whatsoever because the tryptamines are denatured by an enzyme found in the human stomach that we call monoamine oxidase. They could only be taken orally if taken in conjunction with some other substance which momentarily denatured the MAO found in the human gut. Well, as Dennis has done so much to reveal to the world, the liana, Banisteriopsis capi, has these beta-carbolines in it, harmine and harmaline, which turn out to be MAO inhibitors of the precise sort necessary to potentiate the tryptamines. And Schultz was simply astonished by this. And he heard about it, but he would not collect the admixtures until some years later. And in fact, it turns out that it was William Burroughs, of all people, when he went down looking for the ultimate mind-bending high. If you are familiar with the book, the Yahe Letters, the letters between Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs, as each of them take journeys to the Amazon. And of course, in the Yahe Letters, as Burroughs is writing back to Ginsberg, Doc Schindler, who guides Burroughs to the Putumayo, secures Yahe for him, is none other than Professor Schultz, of course. But it was Bill Burroughs who actually collected the first specimen of Psychotria viridis. Now, the extraordinary thing about this is not simply the stunning pharmacological effect that combination of plants induces, but what the nature of that knowledge tells us about the intuitions and empirical observations of the indigenous people. You think about it, the Amazonian flora contains literally tens of thousands of vascular plants. How did the indigenous people learn to combine these two morphologically distinct denizens of the rainforest to create this kind of biochemical version of the whole being greater than the sum of the parts? The only scientific explanation was trial and error, and which for Schultz, was simply a meaningless euphemism. Statistically, it made no sense. And yet, when you would ask the indigenous people, they would say that the plants teach us. Well, what did that mean? Schultz famously in 1940, let's see, must have been about 1951, amongst the Sequoia, recorded the use of 17 different varieties of the Banisteriopsis capilliana, all of which were referable to his taxonomic eye as being the same species. And yet the Sionan sequoia in the forests of Ecuador distinguish these different plants consistently, their varieties, their folk varieties, at great distances in the forest. And when he asked them the nature of their systematics, their classification, they looked at him as if he was a fool, because after all, any real botanist would know that you took each one of the 17 varieties on the night of a full moon, and each one would sing to you in a different key. Now that, as Schultz knew, would not get you a PhD at Harvard, but it was a lot more interesting than counting flower parts. And it spoke about a different depth of knowledge. And even in something as mundane as the curare preparations that he was sent to document and what he discovered in their elaboration. The creation of a curare is not very complicated. You take the plant in question, you boil it, you eventually boil down the water until you get a thick viscous substance that can go onto a dart or an arrow. The dart doesn't kill the prey. The poison gets into the musculature, and the muscle relaxant causes the animal, be it a monkey or a bird in the canopy, to lose muscular control and fall from the top of the forest. And often it's a fall that kills the prey. But here's the interesting thing. You can drink as much curare as you want. And unless you have a open bleeding ulcer, nothing will happen to you, because you have to get the curare into the bloodstream for it to be efficacious. So again, you can see how this notion of trial and error appears to be almost a meaningless euphemism. And this is what really carried Schultz away. The native people, he realized, had their own explanations, rich cosmological accounts that were, from their perspective, perfectly logical. Sacred plants that had journeyed up the Milk River in the belly of the anaconda, potions prepared by shaman, the drifting souls of jaguars dead from the beginning of time. Now, Schultz, as a scientist, didn't take those myths literally, but they suggested a certain delicate balance. These were ideas, he would write half a century later, of a people who did not distinguish the supernatural from the pragmatic. The indigenous people, Schultz realized, believed in the power of plants, accepted the existence of magic, acknowledged the potency of the spirit. Magical and mystical ideas entered the very texture of their thinking. Their botanical knowledge could not be separated from their metaphysics. Even in the way they ordered and labeled the world was fundamentally different. It was in Sibundoy with Salvador Sindo en route to the Putumayo that Schultz first learned from a Capuchin priest that the indigenous people did not distinguish the color green from the color blue. For them, the priest explained, the sky is green and the forest is blue. And this was a strange concept that lingered in his imagination even as he entered the lowlands. And it was then that he realized that though trained at the finest botanical institution in America, after only a month in the Amazon, he felt increasingly like a novice. The indigenous people knew so much more. And so he had gone to South America because he had wanted to find the gifts of the rainforest, leaves that heal, fruits and seeds that supply the foods we eat, plants that could transport the individual to realms beyond this dimension. And yet within a month of an experience that would go on for 12 uninterrupted years, he had already learned that in unveiling the indigenous knowledge, his task was not merely to identify new sources of material wealth, but rather to understand, more importantly, a new vision of life itself, a profoundly different way of living in the forest. And by the time he reached the Kofan, by reputation, as I say, the finest manipulators of psychoactive and biodynamic plants in the Northwest Amazon, he was beginning to feel at home in a realm of phytochemical wizardry unlike anything he had ever imagined. And this was the world that he opened to all of us through his extraordinary journeys, which I would chronicle in the book, One River. Thanks very much. How are we doing, Shannon? Can I?
Perfect. Thanks so much, Wade. Can you hear me?
I better turn up my thing a little bit so I can hear.
Can you hear me? Let's see how we are for the echo.
Now I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good. We have a little echo, but I think we'll be fine.
No, I'll just pull this down a little bit. Okay, good.
Thank you so much for sharing that very thorough and enlightening information and history with us. It's definitely an honor to have you here today. So I just wanted to say thanks again on behalf of MAPS for being here with us. We definitely appreciate it. So we do have a few questions. Are you okay to?
Sure.
Perfect. So if you want to follow along with me, they are in the Ask a Question. If not, you can just relax and I'll read them out here to you.
You throw the questions my way.
Perfect. So the first one is from Melissa, and she says, "Hi, Wade. Could you please expand on your thoughts regarding the use of psychedelics as a plant medicine from the perspective of integration into Western cultural values? How are we doing taking indigenous concepts of healing and understanding how to both utilize them ethically and also apply the healing benefits in a very different culture?" So I can read that again if you want.
Well, I think first of all, it is true that one of the curious anomalies of botanical science is the fact that of the 120 or so known hallucinogenic plants, 90% or more are from the Americas. And that's not because the forests of equatorial West Africa or of Southeast Asia were depauperate. It's just that, and people in those places certainly exploited those forests for biodynamic plants. But of course, the use of these substances is rooted in culture, and in both Equatorial West Africa in particular, through spirit possession, there's another vehicle to the divine. So these substances tend to be in the Americas, but also they were used in Europe. So it's not as if, there's an issue of cultural appropriation in this common universal desire that we all share to invoke techniques of ecstasy that periodically transform our perceptions and enter realms of new states of consciousness. I think that when you think of worldviews, we tend to be culturally myopic. We think that our way is the real way, and the way that we interact with nature, for example, we think is a norm, but it's actually highly anomalous. We're all children of Descartes, and Descartes said that only phenomena that could be measured could exist. And so in a single phrase, he de-animated the world, such that a forest is simply board feet and cellulose, a mountain is just a pile of inert rock. And that way of thinking about the world around us, of course, has real consequences for our ecological footprint. If you actually look around the world, by far the more common dynamic between people and the natural environment is one of reciprocity, whereby the earth owes its bounty to human beings, and human beings in turn owe their fidelity to the earth. And this has really significant consequences. And I think that one of the real, at least for me, illuminations that came out of the psychedelic experience was that unbelievable sensation, the visceral sensation you have that everything around you is alive, that everything is interconnected. And that's not an illusion. It's actually how we know through physics, quantum physics, things actually exist. And I know that it may sound strange, but I remember taking a big heroic dose, as Terence McKenna used to say, of a new species of San Pedro that Tim Plowman and I had found in Bolivia in 1974. And, we took a large concentration of this. And I remember sort of in the desert, sort of staring at a single blade coming out of the sand and stones of a blade of grass from of the desert, and simply staring at it for Lord knows how long. It just seemed absolutely miraculous to me. And I again, if someone had been watching me do that, they probably would have thought I had gone mad. But in fact, I was just enchanted by the wonder of photosynthesis and the capability of something surviving in that harsh environment. And the funny part of the story is I was so enchanted that I tried to write a telegram to Professor Schultz that began, "Dear Professor, we are all ambulatory plants." But fortunately, Tim kept me from sending the telegram. But again, my point is that I think psychedelics, one of their most useful windows that they open is the window that says the obvious, which is, of course, one of the great lessons of COVID, is that we are biological beings living on a living biological planet. The Earth doesn't exist as some kind of stage set upon which only the human drama unfolds. And that's a really important lesson we have to learn after 300 years of consuming the ancient sunlight of the world.
Absolutely. Thank you for that answer. And I definitely think that's a wonderful answer, and something that I think collectively we need to move forward is just realizing that oneness, right? And that's something that psychedelics can definitely help us do and achieve. Are you okay for a couple more questions here? I know we're nearing time. This one is from Paul on Instagram, and he says, "Wade, can you please share your thoughts on our current emergence of an axial age whereby our interest in research in cosmology, theology, and consciousness may lead to a transformation of the human being, and will it offer hope for the future of humanity?"
Well, I think it's, we're always impatient with the pace of change. But if I say to my students, if you think of the way my grandparents, maybe your great-grandparents thought, in 1911, in the Oxford English Dictionary, there was no definition of homosexuality. There was no definition of racism. There was no definition of colonialism. People took it as a given, the existence of diverse races of humanity. People took it as a given that the earth was in some sense infinite in its bounty, that the place of women was where it was, and that men were to rule, and that people who were white were smart and people who were black were this or that. We can go down the list of certitudes of that era, each one of which we find shocking today and astonishing to contemplate, right? So things change very quickly. And of course, that's been one of the great contributions of anthropology. These ideas didn't shift on their own. It was people like Franz Boas, who ranks with Darwin and Freud and Einstein as the great figures of intellectual lore, intellectual innovation. What he said about culture was a shattering of the European mind. That every culture deserves to be heard. Every culture has something to say. That none has a monopoly on the route to the divine. That there is no such thing as primitive. We are living through a period of transformation, which we spoke about earlier. The role of women, people of color, etc. So even though we're frustrated by the pace of change, the river of history is rolling, And I think there are two things that have happened in my lifetime that will be spoken about 10,000 years hence as inflection points of the millennium. And one, of course, is the vision of the Earth from space brought to us on Christmas Eve, 1968, where for the first time we saw not a limitless frontier, but a finite blue marble or an orb, as the astronauts famously said, floating in the velvet void of space. I mean, everything changed with that vision. But the other revelation, which we're less familiar with, also came about as a consequence of a great journey, but a journey not into space, but in the very fiber of our being. And that is a journey of modern genetics, in which we have shown without doubt whatsoever that the genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. We are all cut from the same genetic cloth. Race is an utter and total fiction. And what this means, of course, is not just that we're all brothers and sisters, quite literally, but it means that the way you choose to live is just an option. And we may have embraced technological sophistication as a measure of success, but for the Aboriginal people of Australia, it's that same human genius that we all share by definition has been invested in the complex task of unraveling the mystic threads of memory in a myth. There is no hierarchy of culture. That old Victorian idea that we went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized to the Strand of London, that Victorian European society sat at the apex of a pyramid that went down the slopes to the so-called primitives of the world, has been absolutely discredited by modern science, shown to be an artifact of the 19th century, no more relevant to our lives today than the notion that clergymen had then that the earth was but 6,000 years old. The interesting thing is we still haven't absorbed the revelations of genetics. You still hear people using the term primitive culture. You still hear people using the word race. Both those concepts have no meaning whatsoever, and they will not be used in the lifetime of my grandchildren. They will not exist. And that will be the beginning of the creation of a truly multicultural, pluralistic world in which we all recognize that we all are indeed connected.
Absolutely. And that's just so wonderful to hear you say that. And we have someone that's posted in the comments. His article in the Rolling Stone is also very lucid and insightful and worth the read. So for those of you that haven't read that yet, like we've said, it has over 200 million views now, or impressions on social media. So if you haven't read that, it's definitely worth the read there. Can we do one more question?
Sure.
Are you okay with that? Okay. So the next one here is from Antonio. And Antonio asks, why do you think the use of natural psychedelics like ayahuasca or psilocybin-containing mushrooms in naturalistic settings is having such a surge in popularity? Do you think humans have a natural tendency to use these substances in ceremonial or ritualistic settings?
I think that's a really wonderful question. Andy Weil, who, if those of you who may be young and may not know the seminal work of Andy Weil, he was like my big brother. He was another student of Schultz's, but nobody in the world has thought more deeply and written more profoundly about the nature of human drug use than Andy. And of course, he's gone on to transform medicine with the integrative program that he has at University of Arizona. But Andy says wonderful things, and his first book, The Natural Mind, even though he would be the first to say it's somewhat dated with some of the kind of hipster language that we used to use back in the 60s, the fundamental messages are eternal. And he makes the obvious point that ethnography supports, that the desire to periodically transform consciousness is so ubiquitous in the human record that it has to be seen as part of a basic human appetite. and how people choose to satisfy that fundamental desire to get into an altered state of consciousness can range from the use of ordeal, vision quests, meditation, dervishes spinning or whatever, or the use of these sacraments. But it is so ubiquitous in the ethnographic record. It's got to be some kind of a basic appetite. And one of the things he points out is that why is it that indigenous people have used these substances for literally thousands of years with no evidence of social disruption or let alone toxicity and addiction? And he has a certain number of basic things. First of all, they use these substances in the natural form, which is pharmacologically the safest. And, it's a stunning anecdote that the first morphine addict was a wife of the man who invented the hypodermic syringe. The cigarettes only became dangerous, or tobacco, with the development of the cigarette that allowed you to inhale tobacco with these mild strains of leaves into the lungs, right? Before that, you would die of cancer of the mouth, the tongue, or whatever. And secondly, they accept that the use of these substances is a legitimate thing to do if done judiciously. And that means paying attention to set and setting and enveloping the user in a protective cloak of ritual that will mitigate some of the potentially unsettling impacts of these substances, particularly a preparation like ayahuasca. And we, by contrast, define drugs by not by their pharmacological reality, but by moral and ethical and legalistic frameworks that we impose upon them culturally. And so we send a series of mixed messages to children, which is one of the reasons that we remain so completely, messed up about the nature of drug use. And I think what's going on now, it's just really remarkable that there is this renaissance, and it's a renaissance that reflects our needs. I mean, we need to find some kind of connection to the natural world. We need to reconnect with each other. Look, someone mentioned the Rolling Stone piece. I mean, Americans consume 2/3 of the world's antipsychotic drugs. That can't be healthy. The leading cause of death of people under 50 in the United States right now is opioid addiction and overdosing. These are all signs of a culture that has a very complex and mixed up and unproductive relationship with drugs. And again, as Andy said, there's no such thing as good and bad drugs. There are only good and bad ways of using drugs. I mean, even something like cocaine, which is such an ugly drug in so many ways, is to this day one of our best topical anesthetics for nose, throat, and ear surgery. And when taken simply as the plant itself, it's the divine leaf of immortality. It's the greatest and most benign and gentle and useful stimulant that makes coffee and tea and mate look like sort of destined for the dustbin of history. And yet we treat coca as if it's equivalent with cocaine, which is like treating potatoes as equivalent of vodka.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that actually was the next question that was asked here by Jordan about there are no good or bad drugs, only good and bad uses of drugs.
Yeah, good and bad ways of using drugs. I mean, I think I think that's kind of obvious. And I mean, the bottom line is that this war on drugs that was set in motion largely for political reasons by Richard Nixon has cost countless lives, countless amounts of treasure. We're talking 30 and 40 and $50 billion a year to fight a war that none of the advocates of the war want to win. I'll tell you a funny story. When I came back in 1975, having served as my brother Tim Plowman, and we were studying the botany and the ethnobotany of coca, the source of cocaine, for the U.S. government. And amongst many wondrous things that we discovered was that, first of all, this plant was extraordinarily nutritious. It had more calcium than any other plant studied by science, which made it perfect for traditional diets that had lacked a dairy product. It had enzymes which enhanced the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, which made it perfect for the tuber-based diets of the Andes. It was chock full of vitamins to the extent that a daily consumption of coca leaves was equivalent to the recommended daily allowance of vitamins by our own medical system. And that it had a little bit of alkaloid in it, which served benignly as absorbed through the mucous membrane, a benign stimulant in a harsh environment. And so there was a job available at the USDA that Tim demanded that I apply for, but he told me that if I took the job, he'd kill me. And so I was curious, and I went out to the USDA, and I met this character who I immediately could tell was DEA, right, posing as a USDA guy. And I walked into his office, and the first thing I recognized was he was a drug addict. You couldn't get into the office for the cigarette smoke. And then I looked at his walls, and they were covered by seized paraphernalia, right? And I thought, well, this is like going into the office of an anti-pornographer and having naked pictures of women and pedophiles on the walls. And then I'm looking at this guy, and remember, this is 1975, so fashions were pretty dreadful, even for characters like him. He had a big butterfly collar, gold chains around his neck, gold nuggets on his fancy watch. And I'm thinking, you know, where have I met this guy before? And it turns out that the only thing they had distilled from our 2 years of field work was that Tim and I were good at finding coca plantations. So my job, had I accepted it, was to go back to the plantations throughout Latin America, find the biological pests that destroy coca, and bring them back so we could manipulate them and reintroduce them to destroy even more. That's all they got out of our years of study. And as I'm looking at this character, I'm thinking, where have I met you before? Well, of course, I hadn't literally, but I'd met him 1,000 times in Medellin amongst the cartel, because I lived in a farm in Medellin just when the cartels were beginning. Carlos Leder was right up the road. You know, cocaine was everywhere. I never used it. I never liked it. But the point is, the sleazeballs of the worst of the cartel were exactly like this guy. They were two sides of the same coin, and neither one had any interest whatsoever in resolving the war on drugs, because that's the big hypocrisy. Look at Colombia. My new book, Magdalena, River of Dreams, you know, is a love letter to Colombia. Here's a nation that has suffered 220,000 dead, 7 million internally displaced, 5 million people fleeing their country, all because of a conflict that wouldn't have lasted a day without the profits of cocaine. You know, the year that the FARC finally put down their arms and peace began in the process in Havana, that year the FARC, reduced to 6,000 cadre, mostly teenage and young kids in search of meals, had made $600 million from cocaine. Well, you give me the Beverly Hills Boy Scouts and $600 million, and I can terrorize Southern California. And all of that money comes from consumption. And so everybody you know who's used cocaine, and every government that's facilitated the illicit trade by making the drug illegal, but doing nothing to really prohibit it, to limit its distribution, all of those individuals have the blood of innocent Colombians on their hands. And again, this is the child of the war on drugs, and yet in a country of 52 million people, there were never more than 200,000 combatants. The vast majority of Colombians who have never seen, let alone used cocaine, have been innocent victims of wars that only have existed and been fueled by the illicit profits of the cocaine. Do you realize, Shannon, that at the height of the cartel in Medellin, when Pablo Escobar and the Ochoa brothers, the Medellin cartel was making $60 million a day. They budgeted every week $1,000 just to buy elastic bands to wrap the illicit cash in. That was the scale of the American and European consumption, all of which created the bloodshed and the misery of innocent people in Colombia. And the book does many things. And it doesn't just talk about that. It celebrates the real, true wonder of the people that were able to survive that because of the extraordinary character and their spirit of place and all that. Anyone who's been to Colombia knows it's the most extraordinary country in the Americas.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's just absolutely devastating to hear. And I was actually going to ask you about the book because I think in your bio it said it would be out in September. Is there a date?
Yeah, it came out in London to very strong reviews last week. And like all these books, COVID's delayed them. So, it was supposed to come out in April. It's coming out September 14th in North America, in New York and Toronto. But of course, it can be ordered on Amazon.com. And I got a call just last week from ex-presidente Juan Manuel Santos, who won the Nobel Prize for Peace. And he told me that it was a book that every Colombian should read. And in his last paragraph of his own memoir, soon to be published, he cites the book and very, very warmly. And my friend Hector Abad described it as a love letter to the country. And he said that only such a book could make him love Colombia again. So it's really, I encourage people to share the word of that book, not for my sake, honestly, but because it shows all that is wonderful and great about the Colombian people. It's like a mirror that they will see how extraordinary they are. And for people beaten down psychologically by 2 and 3 generations of being treated like a pariah, anything we can do to mitigate the kind of the negativity, the despair, the cynicism, all of that serves the peace process, which remains precarious for all kinds of reasons.
We have posted some links to it in the chat in the side here, if anyone wants to take a look at it. And it's definitely something I can't wait to read, given how eloquently you speak and how well you write. I'm sure it's definitely going to be something that a lot of us are going to appreciate.
Well, thanks very much, Shannon.
And I just wanted to say that we are super appreciative to have you here as well. And like I said, honored to have you here to support MAPS, to share such important history with us. And we're also super excited to have you back in the second series coming up, which we actually haven't put out live yet, but we'll be announcing in the next week or so. So I just wanted to ask if you had any final words that you wanted to share with the group before we close here.
Well, just, that those of you who are drawn to these substances, they're powerful substances, they're sacred medicines, and use them carefully, judiciously, support your friends in the use of them. If the substances remain illicit, be extremely careful in that sense, because you don't want any kind of criminal record, just or unjust, upon your resume. Talk to people. Those of you who have not tried any psychedelics, speak to people, before you do that, and find people who can guide you on the path, and be there for you, because these substances wouldn't be so transformative if they weren't so powerful. And it is true what my mother feared, is that you take these substances and you don't come back the same, which is also part of the great glory of what is revealed to you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Like I said, it's been a pleasure to have you here, Wade, and I look forward to having you back on the second series as well, and learning more.
Thanks very much, everybody. God bless. Take care.
Thanks so much, Wade.
Okay, you bet.
So, as this is our final episode of the series, I would like to take some time to thank those that have helped make this webinar series possible. Thank you again to our guest speaker today, Wade Davis, and thank you to all of our 14 amazing speakers that have joined us throughout the series. Thank you to the MAPS Canada volunteers who have been assisting with this event behind the scenes. You might have seen Kenny pop in and Michael and Lionel as well with our tech support that have been helping bring this to you, making sure that the connection is good. And also thank you to our amazing sponsors. If you haven't checked out the perks that are complimentary to you for joining the series, feel free to do that as well. All of the episodes will remain on Crowdcast, so you can log in at any time and watch them all again if you would like. And if you've missed some, make sure and go back and watch those as well. Most importantly, thank you to all of you for being here, joining us to support this series, to support MAPS, and to support this very important research. So as you know, by now, we've been mentioning we will be announcing our season 2 of the webinar series very soon. We have close to 25 speakers lined up for season 2 in a 15 episode series, and we can't wait to tell you all about it. So thank you again to Wade Davis for joining us today. Thank you to all of you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you all in season 2. Bye for now.